Joining us now to discuss the NATO summit is military veteran John Byrnes, Senior Advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. John, thanks for being here tonight.
Always great to talk to you.
Great. So the 75th anniversary of NATO came and went in April, but it's being celebrated this week again at the D.C. NATO summit. There's a lot of high-fiving going around on the post-war liberal democratic consensus, but do you think perhaps NATO deserves a little more of a critical appraisal, at least in light of recent events?
Not just in light of recent events, but in light of its history. What has it been built for? What does it serve for? What has it become now? While NATO foreign ministers are here, as you put it, celebrating, meeting, discussing what they see as the future of NATO, big issues like who should help support Ukraine and where that money should be coming from, where those weapons should be coming from. There have been some alternate conferences thinking through alternatives, rethinking NATO. How can we change? How can we grow? How can we better the experience that we have with NATO? How much more should the Europeans be doing to secure their own continent? And CVA, Concerned Veterans for America, has gotten to participate in several of those alternate conferences.
And I think you're in the area, right, attending some of those conferences. So can you lay out what some of the talk is about, what can be done to correct course here with NATO, or, failing that, what else can be done to make sure, our foreign affairs, they don't keep leading us the way they have been, where American interests are just ground under to these more global interests?
Well, I can tell that it's a NATO conference because the traffic in D.C. is even more brutal than it usually is. However, some of the conferences have been truly alternate. They're just looking for ways to potentially end NATO or rethinking a NATO future. Others have been more balanced, where, I heard from folks who've been ambassadors to NATO. I've heard from scholars who are completely for leaving NATO, and I've heard from a lot of people in between. Interestingly, the biggest thing I heard from kind of most of the totally pro-NATO partisans and most of the anti-NATO partisans is, either way, European countries need to be carrying a bigger share of the burden, not just in terms of spending, but in terms of how they use their military's comparative advantages.
And it seems like the U.S., one of the reasons why we like NATO so much, even though it's our men for the most part, our money for the most part, our weapons for the most part, being used to protect all these other smaller nations. But, it makes us feel like, well, we're the top dog and they're kind of our client states and we kind of get to run things. And I get that to a degree, but NATO hasn't been serving American interests, hasn't done so in a long time. So is that one of the main issues that we should have when it comes to NATO?
Well, I think if you look back in the early 50s, President Eisenhower said he couldn't expect NATO being around for much more than 10 years, right? The thought was that this was an intermediate security arrangement until the Europeans were able to stand on their own. Obviously, the idea was that we would still partner with Western European countries, particularly democracies. The end of the NATO moment, 1988, 1990, the Berlin Wall fell. We saw the fall of Soviet communism, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of scrambling back then. I grew up, I turned into a teenager during the Reagan 80s. It was the high watermark for NATO. It was when NATO became this myth, this romanticized great organization that helped us defeat Soviet communism. And there's been a hangover from that, right? We saw NATO help us join the war in Afghanistan after September 11th. You and I have talked about what a debacle that turned into. Part of it was, the ISAF NATO group that was there was very uncoordinated, very misdirected. And again, we really have to start rethinking what America's commitments are. What is the best force posture for us going forward? How much more of Europe's security can the Europeans take for themselves? And how to balance that spending and that use of military forces, that balance of military forces.
Like you're talking about that unipolar moment that we had now, a little over 30 years ago. It seems like NATO then almost lost its reason to exist because, like you said, the main idea was to oppose the Soviet Empire, and that's a worthy goal. But then now you have the Soviet Empire, it falls apart, and now you have Russia. And Russia says, can we join, at least a few years later? And then they go, not really. And then you start to see Russia go, oh, wait, so you're saying you're just a purely anti-Russia force now. And then, of course, now we see states like Ukraine, Georgia, and others being told that at some point in the future, they're most likely going to be brought into NATO. Now, obviously, we see NATO by proxy supporting Ukraine to the nth degree. And so Russia's looking at that and going, oh, so you just hate us because a lot of these states are nowhere near the North Atlantic. And, you're putting up missile bases and the rest right along our borders, and we told you not to do that. So do you think in some ways NATO has gone on to search for new monsters after losing their original villain?
Well, it's clear that the views both in the U.S. and in Europe have changed about what NATO is for. They're not always in alignment across both sides of the Atlantic. As far as Russia, I actually got to sit and listen to 5 scholars today debating like when Russia decided that NATO was no longer going to be useful to it after that moment where they thought about joining. They probably, when the Berlin Wall fell and when the Soviet government fell in Russia, there's some ideas that maybe they saw it as a potentially stabilizing influence in Europe. But as it encroached closer and closer, more and more into Eastern Europe, and as Russian leadership changed from Gorbachev to Yeltsin and then eventually to Putin, the view of what Soviet's western border, Russia, I keep saying Soviet, it's a lifelong habit, but what Russia's western border should look like and how secure it should be, it excludes NATO being very close if Putin gets what he wants.
That it does. John, we really do appreciate you making time for us. I know you've been busy going from conference to conference, but we really do appreciate your analysis. Thanks for joining us tonight.